So Shounak, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. We just wanted to start off by giving you a chance to talk about what it is that you want to accomplish if elected to a second term. Why have you re-upped for this?
Sure. Well, we set ourselves on a good path on a lot of different issues the last 4 years. COVID really threw a wrench in it in terms of progress. We slowed on a lot of different fronts where I would have expected to see more progress had we not slowed. Inequity and mental health, we made gains there, but it was really, I would say the largest gains were closer to the end of my term, considering, we set ourselves up in the first year and a half, COVID hit, and then we sort of made slow progress until 2022, end of 2021. So I would expect to see those things progressing over the next 2 years, and then certainly the following two, but almost as if the first term were extended by 2 years, where I had seen the district ending up at the end of my 4-year term in those areas is what I would expect to see through by 2024, which is to say the implementation of the SWIFT plan, for example. Many of those initiatives are ongoing, but really seeing that through, making sure that we're doing everything we can be doing, everything we said we were going to be doing to be supporting our struggling students and of course by extension all of our students. And then mental health, it's great we've allocated money, and it's great that we're already making steps to use that money well. But again, seeing that through and seeing, well, what is a school-based mental health system going to look like with the money that we've allocated? That needs time, and that's what I'd like to see through. And also what public comment and participation in our board meetings is going to look like, because it happened in a couple different ways during the pandemic. Out of necessity, we were on Zoom, and then we switched back, and now we're on Zoom again permanently. And I am very interested to see whether the makeup of individuals who participate in our governance changes. And I expect it will, based on the comments I received that led me to move to enshrine public participation via Zoom. But to me, that's going to be a very interesting and valuable development over the next 4 years, and seeing how we incorporate that public participation into our decision making.
So no question, you had among the most challenging situations to be on any governing board with COVID and navigating through the pandemic. What are some of the things that you learned in your first term that you hope to be carrying through if elected to a second term? How are you different now than you were 4 years ago?
I said somewhere that it was like dog years, but in the best possible way. I mean, there are a lot of reasons, a lot of things I learned about the district and about how to govern, but really the thing that I learned the most, just as a person, and being a elected person and a representative, a trustee, it was this sort of realization I had during COVID, a time of a lot of anxiety and fear. We reopened schools, and yeah, we were doing everything we could to make sure it was safe. We were complying with our public health guide. We were doing all these things, but there was a lot of anxiety and anger both ways. You're not opening fast enough, you're opening too soon, etc. And we received all of that, individual board members. I had folks who I know and I respect in the community, and having grown up here, my own teachers and mentors who were telling me things like, you're going to be responsible for kids that die, or how much space do you have in your backyard for children's graves, which is a hard thing to hear, to say the least. The thing I learned from that, though, a very important thing I learned from that is that when people come to you as an elected official, they're coming from a place of an unmet need, and that need is agency in the state of in our case, the district, right? And so what changed in me was how I took that feedback, not as an attack, but really coming from a place of anxiety and a desire for information. And even if ultimately the decision we make wasn't the decision that folks wanted, to be as transparent about the decision-making process as possible, and to connect with people as much as possible so that they knew, even if the decision wasn't the one they wanted, at least I was being thoughtful and taking and hearing them, not just listening. So, that's sort of a kind of vague, but I really think that's the most valuable thing I took out of it. And I felt like I grew a lot in those 2 years in the way that I not only listened, but appreciated community feedback, especially the community feedback that on its face value seemed like a personal attack, which I know is not very much not the case. And it helps because it makes me more receptive to a wider perspective of community feedback.
Sure. Do you feel that there were any decisions that were made with respect to reopenings and to safety that in hindsight you might have advocated for something different at this point?
I think it's a good question. It's a hard one. I've thought about it a lot, obviously. Trying to sort of litigate past decisions. And it's hard, based on the information we had at the time, I don't think I would make a different decision. Based on the information we have now, could we have opened sooner safely? Maybe, and yet it's an unknown, right? I mean, maybe it just so happened that we opened at the right time to avoid getting hit with COVID and avoid outbreaks in our school. And it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was truly that our mitigation measures very effectively prevented that. Hard to tell. So yeah, given the information, probably would make the same decision. Don't know though, in hindsight, if there was anything that could have been drastically different than it was, other than how it was communicated to the public. And I think we felt this, I personally felt this from my other governing agencies as a community member. I'm getting a lot of information here and not enough here. And it's hard, the ball keeps moving and I don't know, and nobody knew. But at the same time, I think government agencies that did it well were able to communicate that sense of uncertainty and say sort of, we're right there with you, but here's our plan in a reassuring way. I think what we did in hindsight is we did, right? We said, here's what we're doing. We're going to do it. And it's going to be the decision that's going to get schools open the safest. The missing piece there, I think, was that part where we tell the community, we're not sure either. We think this is the right way to do it because of this. And we're going to go for this. We understand there are concerns. We understand it's a time of great uncertainty. We're doing what we think is best based on this. I don't know that we explicitly laid that out to the community in, say, a letter like other school districts did. So the communication piece would be different, in my view.
I had a similar question to Jocelyn's, but not COVID related. What action have you guys taken or process that you've reconsidered in your mind would you like to redo over the last year, say?
I would have liked this, the English, the ELA committee.
Mm-hmm.
What I would have liked, and I said this when we made the vote, was when that committee was convened a year and a half ago, whenever it was. When that committee was convened, I would have liked to see very specific guidelines on what the committee's role was and what the committee's scope was. Because what happened was I don't think that was clear. And then on the back end, I, as a board member, had to look at all the pieces we had and say, okay, what's my role in taking it? How do I take into consideration the decision or lack of decision the committee came through? And I think guiding information on how that information is to be used in an ultimate board decision is very important to set expectations on the front end. For example, if it said, okay, the committee's recommendation is one piece of a 6-part puzzle, and the staff will come to you with the final recommendation, and it's not up or down either way, or something else. That was sort of presumed, I think, in my mind after the fact, reading all the information and kind of justifying how I would take the information, but it wasn't set out in the beginning. And doing so would have avoided a lot of community concern. It would have avoided a lot of anger and folks being upset and feeling like their decisions or their opinions weren't being taken into account, especially teachers and some parents as well in the community. So that's one thing I would have definitely done differently.
So this communication/transparency issue is one that has plagued this district for many, many years, long before you came on the board. But I think there are some who believe and observe that since Don Austin became superintendent, there's been a concerted effort, at least on his part, maybe on the part of the board majority, to minimize those issues that are brought to the board and to shorten the meetings and to basically put a roadblock as far as sort of open public discussion about issues, that many more issues are coming to the board either on consent or not even coming to the board at all. I wonder if you've observed that, and if so, what you feel about it.
Sure. To me, it seems like the pendulum swing from the 4 years or more prior to 4 years ago, where, as I recall, when we went into the beginning of my term, we had come off of, well, let me back up. I think when Ken was elected, a part of that was this new approach to getting the house in order. It was a departure from the district's trajectory for a while before that, and Ken and Terry, worked on that, and then Todd and Jennifer were elected, and the board makeup changed. The district changed in its approach to governance. That efficiency and that prioritization of efficiency continued, and I've also heard a lot of feedback that the pendulum has swung now to being past efficiency and to the point of being streamlined so much that important things aren't making it on the agenda. Board members have raised that at board meetings, myself included, and I think now we will see it shift back to a more moderated position where we are comfortable as a board, at least I am comfortable as a board, that we are capable of being efficient, regardless of the items that come up on the agenda. We are capable of having a discussion. Everybody does their homework, which is really key. Everybody is good about staying on topic. We are capable of having conversations at the board level in an efficient way and making decisions in an efficient way, so that when more items are added to the agenda that community wants to see, I'm not worried that efficiency is going to go out the window all of a sudden. I think that was perhaps a function of a different time and a different board, and one that we don't have now. And I think that we have seen, maybe we haven't seen it yet, but I would like to see our agendas be a little meatier in a number of areas. And I think Todd brought this up at a couple of recent board meetings about the role of the board calendar, and saying, look, get stuff on here if you want to talk about it, because this is where we talk about things important to the community. So yeah, I would like to see more things on the agenda. There have been things in the past that weren't on the agenda, and I thought, well, why aren't they there? And then I made a request to agenda setting and got them on. But I think more board members can and should exercise that ability to do so, because we are allowed to do that. I mean, it's our, it's the president's agenda, but it's our agenda. It's the community's agenda. And so when we hear issues of importance, we can and we should say, agenda setting, I want to get this on the agenda. I think for a new board member, I'll go ahead, Bill.
Well, I'm just going to say, I think it's fair to say that what you're describing is not Don Austin's comfort level way to do things. He's been the one driving, I think, since he got here, this idea of let's deal with as many issues as possible without the board's involvement. So I'm wondering, when you describe, your own personal thoughts about this, and to some extent the way you're discussing the board's thinking, just how much of that Don Austin is on board with? Because I mean, he's obviously the critical person to help restore a feeling that the public's got an ability to talk about in front of the board the things that arise as issues.
I think that's partially true, but I don't think he is actually the critical person, because, in agenda setting, and again, this is something maybe we ought to tell the community more about what happens in agenda setting, but in agenda setting, it's really it's the president's agenda. Right. And yeah, there are recommendations by the staff, of course, but by and large, very deferential to what the president and the vice president want to see on the agenda and what board members have requested, more so now than before, probably. I think when Dr. Austin was hired, he was hired for one of the primary purposes was to build an organization that was more efficient with better management. And I think part of that is being more efficient in the board meetings. So his recommendations, I think, were really keyed towards efficiency in the board meetings and streamlining. But it is, I think it's incumbent on the board to exercise what is really the board's sole authority, which is to put items on the agenda. I know that when I was president, I was always interested, and I did hear from my colleagues on items that that should have been on the agenda. And I always brought those up in agenda setting, and we invariably placed them on, if not this agenda, then, we look at the board calendar and here's where it'll fit properly. Not to say other presidents don't do that, but I do think that it's really the board's role. And so to the extent that the community would like to see that shift, it's incumbent on the board to make that absolutely clear, regardless of what Dr. Austin's recommendations are. Yes, we take them and we take them under consideration, but it's on us.
So could we just briefly, just to finish this off, if you could discuss the right at school issue and the childcare as an instance where I think the community felt pretty blindsided, and apparently in agenda setting, the decision was not recognized as an important one to agendize.
Yeah. Well, that goes to the question of what should be on the agenda and what shouldn't. Not in terms of how many items should be on, but what is the board's purview in terms of decision making? And the question, should that have been on the board agenda for a decision before the decision was made? And in hindsight, I think we'd probably say yes, it's an issue of heightened community concern, knowing what we know now. At the time, though, thinking about childcare, in my perspective, it's really the board's responsibility to make sure that the goals we set with respect to childcare, for example, are being met, irrespective of the specific providers that are being used. So if a goal the board sets is, we want to make sure that whatever number of students who, ELOP students need childcare, not free, but reduced rate childcare, want to make sure those needs are being met, staff go and make that happen. And if the district says, okay, well, the way that we're going to make that happen is by hiring this other provider in addition to PAC and cutting the amount that PAC has, then the question is, hi, Adam. The question is it in the board's purview to make that decision? Or by setting the goal and having staff implement the goal, has the board done what its role is to do?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect summary of what happened. And I guess the question is, when the superintendent and perhaps the board feel that, oh, let's just let the superintendent make this decision, it's not a major policy issue, and yet the community is up in arms about something, somebody made a bad judgment call, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, then you got to be alert to more than just policy. You've got to be alert to community input and community brewing controversy. Otherwise, you get an out of control political situation, just like what occurred.
So then what we do is we set up a stakeholder committee, right? An ad hoc committee, a working group with staff members, with community members, and with board oversight. So there's 1 or 2 board members on there to make sure that, okay, district made a decision. Now it's the board's job to make sure that if that decision was the wrong decision, then it's reversed or it's changed. And so now we have to measure the goals that the board set in making that decision, the concerns raised by the community, and then, are the countervailing benefits better or worse? And that's essentially what we've done, or at least we're on the path to that. We have a childcare committee now that is specifically looking at this issue. Mm-hmm. Ken and Jennifer are on it. And if that committee comes back and says, look, right at school is terrible and it's not meeting the needs of those students, and PAC is going to meet the needs of those students, or some other provider is going to meet the needs of those students better, then to me, the board's decision or the district's decision is clear, but of course it will go to the board then because it'll come up through the committee. But the decision is then clear that we made a bad decision and the district made a bad decision under the board's authority. And so we've got to change that.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the goal should be to eliminate the bad decision in the first place. And so it's a matter of what steps can be taken to eliminate bad decisions from being made that turn into the district shooting itself in the foot because it's just created an unnecessary controversy.
Sure.
And I think we've spent enough time on this issue, but unless you got something you want.
Sure. One more thing I'll say. Sorry, Zoe.
Oh, once you're done.
Okay. One more thing I'll say is it's hard to tell what's a bad decision until we look at the data and the results. I don't think it's as easy as saying this is a bad decision because there was a lot of community uproar out of it.
No, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying
Okay.
that when a decision gets made about a topic where there's a lot of community interest in it,
Mhm.
the board, somebody needs to have the sense of when that gathering opposition or concern is out there and say, we got to bring this before the board and let the public and let the media
I see.
report on it, let the public come in and let's hear what they have to say. And it's self-preservation in my mind. It's a step that you can take to head off the kind of bitterness and lack of trust that then results from the way these decisions often get made. But,
yeah, I take your point.
I was going to kind of ask a broader question, which was, you'd mentioned kind of that you've shared concerns about potentially agendas getting too small and about wanting more things for the board to review. And I'm curious, kind of, what are the issues in particular that you'd like to see come before the board, or the topic areas that haven't currently been?
Sure. Well, I'll give you an example from when this did happen. Cubberley. And I had more power over it when I was president because I was setting the agenda. So it's easier to talk about, concrete examples then because I could actually fix them sort of single-handedly. There's very little a board member does individually except on committees and when they're president. But the Cubberley was one. Cubberley came up. That was the year that we engaged in the ad hoc committee. And based on discussions in the ad hoc committee, there was a desire from the city to have a clearer picture of what the district's priorities were. If you recall, the district had previously set a set of priorities. We want to retain this much space for a comprehensive high school, teacher housing, and a district office at Cubberley. Then COVID hit, and then we were having these renewed discussions last year. So then I said, okay, well, I can go and I can put that on the agenda so that the board can discuss it and set some priorities. And so I did that. And then the board did discuss it and we changed our priorities. But that's an example where as the need arises, it's really important to be able to then go and put it on the agenda. If, for example, I hadn't been on the ad hoc committee and I wasn't the president at the time, I would have had to then take it to the president and say, this came up in this ad hoc committee. I'd like to see this on the agenda. And then there's, it's really in the president's hands. Maybe the president doesn't agree that Cubberley should be on the agenda for revisiting priorities. And if that were the case, then that wouldn't make it on. And so, what I think in my mind, the president should be, the role of the board president should not be to necessarily be a gatekeeper to the types of issues that make it on the board agenda in the sense of evaluating them, but rather to be a gatekeeper in the sense of determining whether or not they're within the board's purview, which sort of goes, Bill, to your point, which I suppose I would answer and say, well, then the board president should be the one who is doing better to make sure that community concerns are brought to the board as agenda items. And I am sure there are instances where I have not done as good of a job as I could have, probably every president. Because it's sometimes it's hard to tell what is an item that's going to rise to the level of, but I think ultimately the responsibility and fault, if there's any, lies on the board agenda setting committee, president, and to a lesser extent the vice president. I hope that answered the question, Zoe, but if it doesn't, follow up.
I guess my question was, because Cubberley obviously did come before the board, you did vote on the renewed priorities. I was curious, since you said that you had concerns about the agenda getting too narrow, what are things that you wish had come before the board and didn't, or things in the future that you want on the board agenda that might not otherwise have been there?
Sure. Well, one thing that didn't make it onto the board agenda that I would like to see on the board agenda is the sort of third rail, which is this question of delaning, and which is a very, very controversial topic. And
in reference to math, particularly?
Yeah, and generally too. I mean, we talked about it, Bill, 4 years ago in my interview, and it's a sort of a perennial topic, but it's one that I think deserves to have a community conversation. Now, of course, that has to be centered around an ask, right? I mean, what is the action that the board could take on this? And then the conversation is sort of anchored to that. But I think it's one that's important to have. It's one I'd like to see on. And the value is that instead of district staff coming to us with proposals, for example, standards-based grading, which I support, but standards-based grading, and then community members, there were some who felt, well, that's the delaning in disguise. And I don't know if that's exactly what it was, but point taken, perhaps that would have been better framed up as a conversation, even at like a board retreat or some special study session, right? On this issue. Where does the district stand on the issue? Something that I think we did years ago when we talked about weighted GPA, certainly it was an item of a lot of controversy, but the district ultimately came out and took a stand, sort of an equivocal stand, but a stand. I mean, there was a statement, and this was like, we did research and here's what we came to. We haven't done that about delaning, and it's an item of concern. So in the next 4 years, it's something I'd want to address so that the people who are against delaning, the people who are for delaning, I mean, at least they'll know that the district has looked into it. The board has looked at the studies and the data presented by the district, the concerns brought by the community, and with all of that in mind, reached this decision, whether you like it or not. And then the next step is, of course, vote out the board members who voted for it or voted against it if you don't like it. But I think that's one I'd like to see come up, because I think sometimes there are issues that aren't necessarily ripe because there's no ask tied to them, and so they sort of fester, and they become hotspots whenever there's an issue that touches them, even tangentially. And in my mind, it's better to address it head on, and then you addressed it.
Thank you.
So picking up on Cubberley, since we talked about it, it just seems like Cubberley or the 13th elementary school, there's always been talk about, the enrollment projections, and we need to wait. We can't quite know what the future portends. So we're going to save some acreage or save a site. But it sounds like now you are very open to not reserving this space at Cubberley. And I kind of want just to go through your thinking on that and where you
Sure.
are today. Mm-hmm.
Sure. My position really is that we shouldn't be foreclosing any possibility. I think we've done that in the past. And I voted for, I think the priorities we set have foreclosed that, and I voted for those, but I'll tell you why. We had nothing set in stone before we made those priorities. We had the master plan that was developed, but when that happened, the district wasn't committed to that. It was an exercise in what could be at this site. But in terms of concrete priorities, the district set in, I think, 2019, they were those three that I discussed earlier. And to me, it was like, well, this is progress. We're setting priorities. So then the city will know where we stand, and then we can maybe talk about what happens next. When we revisited that last year, that was, to me, the priorities we set moved even closer to the goal of my goal of being able to support our partners in the city to build what they need to build, while at the same time making sure we are, being fiduciarily responsible and maintaining what we need for ourselves. Okay, we're only going to keep 20 acres, and the other asks we're going to get rid of because this frees up some more land. But I think what we need to do now is be very clear that our priority is to make sure that we can retain some land for a future school. And it should be, I think, as broad as that, because as a part of the discussions last year, what the district presented, and I thought was very interesting, was this idea that you don't need a third comprehensive high school, even if a third high school were to be needed in the future when enrollment upticks. You don't need a third comprehensive high school. And there are other districts that have worked with two comprehensive high schools or some comprehensive high school and then an alternative non-comprehensive high school. And the capacity we have at Pally and Gunn, they are, I mean, it's huge. The construction we've built those schools up to an immense degree. We have a lot of capacity there. And so it's not that we need a comprehensive third high school with a playing field and all the amenities you would normally see in a typical high school. So that's one way to cut down on the acreage. Alternatively, we don't even know whether we're going to need, is it going to be elementary schools? Is it going to be middle schools? Is it going to be high schools? I mean, there's so much uncertainty that my preference is, anything's on the table, as long as, of course, we're going to have to go back and look at it and say, are we going to make the same mistake that the district made years ago when we gave away the elementary school land? Because that's something we can't do. Land, as we know now, has far more staying power than money. So as long as we're making sure that we are protecting our district for the future, I want to see as many plans and proposals as possible from the city for, suppose the city wants to use 10 more of the acres that we've currently prioritized for the district. And they'll say, we'll give you Ventura, we'll give you this other land. Well, I want the district to consider that really and do the analysis for enrollment. Look at what we're going to need, what we might need, how we could make it work with and without that piece of land, so that we actually can answer the city and say, no, this won't work for this reason, or this might work with some tweaks. We just need to start talking in concrete terms. And I think foreclosing and saying, no matter what, this is going to be for a future school. Who knows when, but it's going to be for a future school. That forecloses, I think, proposals to come from the city, because they can just say, well, the district's never going to give that up. They're never going to engage meaningfully in a conversation.
So are you concerned at all with the RENA allocations of bringing 6,000 more homes, and with that families and that many more students, that we really wouldn't need a full comprehensive high school, or just that much more capacity? You feel like the school district as it is has sufficient capacity, regardless of the impending sort of housing rush that's going to be coming in?
If in fact that housing rush results in an increase of students that is commensurate to sort of the number of families that move in, then that's one thing. I actually need the district to present the board with the information on what the impact is going to be. There is an enrollment committee that's working on that right now. I think Todd is on there, but so that's one piece. I think because enrollment has been dropping for the last few years, my gut says that the increased housing isn't going to extend us past capacity at all. But I want the district to present us with the numbers, and then I'll have a better answer.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I was going to pick up on something you mentioned a little bit ago. You said you were going to touch the third rail of delaning. And so I guess the question off of that is, we asked at the forum about the California math framework, and you mentioned that you tend to defer to the fact that the state has made a framework, they put a lot of work into it. But obviously that framework has been controversial and it's still in a draft phase. Current district policy obviously has middle school students generally completing Algebra 1 in 8th grade with an option to go a year faster and do geometry. Do you favor keeping that, or do you favor what the state has suggested, which is moving Algebra 1 into 9th grade, or something else entirely?
Well, I think two things to that. I mean, I think that the way we're doing it in our district, if that's the proposal, right? If staff says, well, this is what we need to retain, notwithstanding the school framework, then that's my presumption shifts, and I say, well, yeah, then this is what we're going to do, superseding what the state came up with. And actually, I did say that I default to the state as a presumption. I didn't do that with the ethnic studies curriculum, I recall, because before I even had a chance to presume, I got so much community feedback on the ethnic studies curriculum and perceived anti-Semitism as a result of that. So I didn't defer to the state on that in my mind. So I guess it's my tendency is to presume, but when I hear community feedback and also staff input, that supersedes, and then the decision is really made on those bases. In this case, we've heard staff input, we've heard community input. We haven't really had a what you could call a knockdown, drag out discussion about math at a board meeting. We've had it in the peripheries, and so based on those discussions, I think that the way the district is doing it now is the right way, because that's the way that staff have said is what's serving our students. Now, there are community members who say that's not serving their students well. And so if that's the case, then we need to have a renewed discussion on that at the board level. And staff should be presenting information about why, in fact, it does serve us. And, again, remembering, and I always remember this, which is, as much as we want to serve every student, and there are ways that we can allow for exceptions to students and things like that. The goal of the public school district, in my mind, is still to make sure that we are serving all students, in the sense that students aren't falling through the cracks. And so if there is a priority, and they're not mutually exclusive, but if there is a order of operations, it's going to be, are struggling students being served by this framework that we have in place? If so, then are there students who are not being sufficiently challenged and for whom exceptions aren't being made? So they're essentially being stuck in classes that they are, that they've surpassed. But it is going to be in that order for me, because to me, at the end of the day, it's like, we are not doing our duty as a public school district if there are students who aren't even meeting that floor. We saw this in reading, and now that's changing. But yeah, that's my answer.
So to follow up, Shounak, as you know, I'm sure the campaign that Nicole and Shauna are waging is being characterized by many in the community as being a distinction between sort of a focus on equity and what you just described, versus more attention being given to the accelerated, achievement-oriented students and parents that don't feel like they're getting what they want out of the school district. How do you reconcile with those 2 points of view? And I also wonder what your response is to those that have been critical of your and some of your colleagues endorsing Nicole really before all the candidates were known that were in the race.
Sure. Well, to the first question, I don't necessarily think those two are mutually exclusive, although there are times and they certainly can be. But there are also, I mean, it can also be said that focusing on equity and focusing on struggling students in a way that is systemic, right? In a way that changes the way we're doing things and not just offers patchwork supports. Doing that, changing the system, necessarily lifts up everybody. So for example, the SWIFT plan, elements of that have to do with curriculum, engagement. I mean, those are things that don't just support struggling students, they support the vast majority of middle, students in the middle. They can also support the students at the top. Reading, for example, when we change the way we teach reading so that our struggling students increase their scores, we're going to see scores increase across the board. For example, if we're emphasizing phonics, and we didn't do that before. So it isn't mutually exclusive. It's not like we are now going to just offer these specific supports to these students and everybody else is going to be left out and not benefit. But I take the point from parents who say that my kid is beyond this level in this class and needs other options. The district has options for those students. Whether they're sufficient is a matter of debate. But I don't think, generally speaking, the two are mutually exclusive at all. And again, I'll anchor back to what I said in the last question, which is, even if they were, I would always come back to the question of, it is more important to make sure we are building a floor than it is to make sure we are raising the ceiling. And it's not a super popular point, and I understand that. And so I want to make sure our district is doing both. But if push comes to shove, to me as a public school district, we've got to make sure we're serving everybody. And by everybody, I mean nobody is falling through the cracks. And then focus on building the ceiling, which we already do very well in Palo Alto. And there are always ways we can do it better. The question of endorsing Nicole,
before you go on to that, let me just follow up for a second here. So do you think this issue, this perceived issue among some parents, that there's not enough enriched, accelerated rigor, however you want to describe it, especially below the high school level, do you think that that's actually not the case, and that what the district is having to deal with is a communication problem with those parents, or a lack of connection with those parents who are agitating for that? Or do you feel like it's a legitimate problem that needs to be addressed?
I think a little bit of both. I mean, I think certainly a part of it is the communication. There are some parents for whom better communication about the opportunities to advance would help. But I also, and I've heard personally from those in the district, parents who very strongly feel that it is a legitimate issue, that the opportunities to excel are not going to sufficiently do what they needed to do for their kids. So to them, it is a legitimate issue, which makes it a legitimate issue for the district. So, I mean, it's sort of a two-parter. Now, should the district address it by making a systemic curriculum change is a question of how many people it affects, what is the current curriculum, and sort of committee work that needs to happen.
Yeah, and what are private schools for?
Right, right.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead with the political side of this.
Sure. Oh yeah, the endorsement. Yeah, it was. We were getting to the point where everybody sort of usually announces the candidacy, and I was looking around. Nobody was announcing a candidacy for school board, and I thought, well, we're gonna have an open seat. And so I was just sort of trying to keep my ear out on folks who were interested in running. And Nicole approached me and other board members, I think, and was asking about running for office and for school board, and her kids were starting TK. And so I encouraged her in the same way someone did to me when I first started to run. I had approached a friend of mine from Gunn in 2017. And I had said, I think I'm back in Palo Alto. I'm thinking about running for school board because all these issues are really important. Maybe in 2020, I'll run. And she said, well, if you're going to run in 2020, you should just run now instead. And so I did. So that I had passed that advice on to Nicole, and she, because I always think it's good for people to get engaged civically, and especially with no other candidates around. I said, you should take a shot at it. And so she did. And I endorsed her then because I thought that there was a real need, and is a real need on the board for diversity. And her views align with mine in terms of equity, certainly. I also, though, think representation is important. And, I am Asian, but I'm not East Asian. And a large percentage of our families and students are. And we haven't historically had the most diverse board. And we know that, and I know at least, that representation on governing boards and positions of leadership really matter, not just so that people's views are being accurately reflected and listened to, but also so that individuals from those backgrounds can look and say, I could do that, or that person is just like me. And that sort of legitimizes the entire thing in their eyes, and gives hope and optimism and things that I never had when I looked at these types of governing bodies growing up, and to some extent now as well. But so that was why I endorsed her. I thought that really is important. We need to have more diversity on the board, and she certainly seems to have a really keen sense of the role of a public school district with respect to equity. So I endorsed her.
Okay, thanks.
So I know our time is running short, but I wanted to sneak in a quick question for you, Shounak, having to do with Superintendent Don Austin. And I know that you have a positive assessment of him for his management of the district and implementing certain plans. At the same time, we've heard from parents who feel like his communication with them has been dismissive, which, if we've heard it, I'm sure you've heard it as well. And I want to know what it is. How do you process that? And if I may, what have you done in response to those parents? How have you addressed this?
Sure. Well, the way I process it as a board member is, wow, we have a communication issue, and we as a district and a board need to do a better job of connecting with our families from the highest levels. The thing that I immediately did to address it was I sort of increased my own outreach, responding to emails, or calling folks who reached out and communicating whatever issues were of concern to them, thinking, at least, if people have different styles of communication, and if this is Dr. Austin's style of communication, and some people comes off as brusque, then I have a very different style of communication, and that may go over well. And it worked to the limited subset of people I talked to. The larger issue, though, is how can the district make sure that it's communicating information to those families in a way that is, comprehensive, not too duplicative, which is always an issue, empathetically, and in a way that is clear and thoughtful and gives folks not only the information they need, but the sense that they are being heard and listened to. Because the truth is, they are being heard and listened to. And board members at least I read all the emails I get, even though I don't respond to all of them because we get so many, and some board members may respond to some that I don't, but they are heard. But how can we effectively communicate that? And so, a public information officer, which is not as some folks have told me, a spin doctor, but a public information officer would be a good start. The danger, of course, is very real that they could become a spin doctor. And so to me, what's very important is as we start that role over the next year, if I'm reelected, and if I'm not, it's important for the board to do this, is to make sure that we have a clear set of guidelines, a clear ethos for how the public information officer is supposed to communicate to the public, right? It's not just information sharing about our successes. That isn't really what we're not marketing. It is truly communication about issues of concern to the community and information parents need to know. And then the board needs a way to exercise oversight on some continuing basis. For example, I think our Title IX and equity information updates are valuable because they give us as a board the opportunity to look at progress on those fronts, on areas of, and Title IX, on areas of historic importance and controversy in the district. We've sort of said, okay, because those have been issues in the past, let's just have them on a continuing basis on the board agenda. So not only is the board watching, but everybody knows the board is watching, and that moves the needle. And I think something similar has to happen with public information, whether that means like we get consolidated updates in a packet that we can review as an information item, or something on an ongoing basis so that there's continuing oversight. Because at this point, I think this falls into the ranks of those historic issues of controversy and importance.
So it sounds like you've given some thought, certainly to the broader communication issue. And I think I want to bring it back to the specifics of Don Austin and his communication style. It sounds like you think that perhaps people are just not receiving him in the way that he is intending, that it's brusque. They say brusque or dismissive when he's just being businesslike. But isn't that something, the relationship between the superintendent and parents or teachers, isn't that something that as a board member you would want to make sure is not happening on an ongoing basis, so you as a board member don't have to come in and kind of massage things, but that it's working from the get-go?
Yeah, it certainly is true. And I have seen in the last year and a half, Dr. Austin has taken great efforts to be receptive to the idea that there are parents and community members who feel that his communications are brusque, and he's changed his tone. There's a matter of just how people communicate and their personalities. And while it is certainly a factor that I would take into consideration in terms of the holistic, how is Dr. Austin as a superintendent, I don't think it's by any means a deciding factor in light of sort of what the goals are on a big scale in terms of management and going in the direction the board sets. It's a factor.
All right.
We should close this out, but I just cannot let go of the opportunity to ask you about the 4-minute closed session that resulted in the termination of Comey. This question was posed to you at the debate, and your answer basically was can't talk about anything that happened in closed session. But since that closed session lasted only 4 minutes, clearly there wasn't any real discussion, and somehow you all had informed yourselves outside of a closed session on what you wanted to do that night. So I just wanted to give you one. I know we had a long conversation about this at the time, but I wanted to give you one final chance to explain, without falling back on the disclosure of a closed session conversation, why it is that the public can't know what your process was for terminating an employee that reported directly to the board.
Sure. I think as the Weekly reported, there were 2 prior closed session meetings that preceded the sort of 4-minute meeting. Without getting into anything, I don't think it's entirely Fidelius to say that it was a 4-minute meeting in a vacuum, because decisions are often made on a continuum. It's like there are things that are discussed in a prior meeting under whatever the agenda item is for that, and then they're discussed afterwards at a subsequent meeting, and the the conversation carries forward in the minds of board members, there's information that's provided in that context that board members read and mull over, and independently or with one other member discuss at length in preparation for a meeting. I mean, our board members all do their homework really well. And so, I would just say there are some things that I think the community in any elected position has to trust, especially if they're closed session. And if they don't think that those people making the decisions are worthy of that trust, then by all means vote them out. But in this particular instance, I don't think it was a 4-minute decision. I know at least that I deliberated on it, at length, and I just think that there is a continuum of decision making, and information doesn't just come in and exit within that one meeting where the ultimate decision is made.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would point out that there was no agendized closed session item, however, relating to this before. In fact, the performance evaluation that was noticed never took place. So somehow you either managed to talk about it in some other context that was not noticed, or there was a lot of paper, email and other forms of communication. So we'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
Just want to give one last opportunity for a question to Adam, since he is our new CEO.
It's good to meet you, Adam.
Yes, thank you, Jocelyn. Yes, I'm sorry for joining late in the shuffle of taking my son home from school. But yes, as I join Embarcadero and take the helm of the Weekly and our other publications, I wanted to get your feedback both as a board member and your interactions with us covering the school district, as well as a longtime citizen, how you evaluate us, what we can do better, what you really like, what you'd like to see more of, less of, if you have any feedback on our performance covering the community.
Sure. I mean, I think I've always liked the Weekly. I think you do a great job of the in-depth. I'm not just saying this because it's an endorsement interview.
I know this is a heck of a time to ask you this question, right?
I know flattery will get me nowhere, but I will say that, I mean, look, for me, I maybe embarrassingly so, but maybe not for you. I check the Weekly every day. I mean, I have it on my little bar because it's the place I get the news for Palo Alto. And importantly, it's the place I get the news to see whether I've been mentioned and what people are saying about me, and the comments that are telling me, that I'm terrible or I'm good. But I mean, it's important because it's another data point to me for what the community sees when they look at our schools. But the way the reporting is done, I appreciate, because I mean, Zoe, at least I know, and Elena before, did a great job of doing the sort of in-depth and like reaching out and having the conversation, which is important. And yeah, I mean, I really have no issues. I think it's a very in-depth paper, and I certainly read it daily.
We need to find more folks like you.
All
You shouldn't say that
Thank
because this is an endorsement interview.
Thank you so much for your time
Thank you,
with
guys.
us, and thank you for your service to the community, and good luck with your campaign.
Thank you so much.